Welcome to the Find Your Leadership Confidence podcast with Vicki Noethling. You are about to discover impactful lessons that help you grow as an individual, grow your confidence, and find the positive and good within you, so you powerfully and authentically become the best version of yourself. Be sure you visit our website at www.findyourleadershipconfidence.com. While you're there, subscribe to us via your favorite network. Now tune in, get ready, and enjoy the journey of emerging as a leader of exception in the 21st century.
Welcome, everyone, to the Find Your Leadership Confidence podcast. I'm your host, Vicki Noethling, coming to you from Roswell, Georgia. The goal of this podcast is to bring topics and guests that will empower you to become that confident leader and take your business and your life to the next level. Today, I am very excited to have Jeff Sigel as my guest, and let me tell you about Jeff. He is the author, coach, and consultant who is passionate about creating better work environments and more fulfilling careers for middle managers everywhere. After 20 years or more of corporate experience at Nabisco, the Hershey company, grocery retailer Ahold, I think it is.
Ahold, yep.
Ahold, and restaurant company Cracker Barrel, Jeff had shifted his focus to coaching mid-level managers and supporting companies looking to empower their middle management team. He currently is the principal consultant for Proprioceptive. I know he'll say that, he'll correct that's the pronunciation, but Proprioceptive LLC, a consultancy focused on turning strategy into action by developing middle management excellence. And he has written a book called The Middle Manners, a toolkit for middle managers. And that is just out right now. So awesome. Today, we're going to talk about Doer-Leader-Influencer, 3 roles of a middle manager. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Sigel. Jeff, so excited. And those that know me know that I am always, even though, now in my career, second career, third career, whatever it is now that I'm on, when I was a corporate, I was always middle management. Yep. And it's part of the reason I do what I do today and still try to work with corporate people, because I think it's a group that's so important and it's often overlooked when it comes to training, developing all the things necessary to push that person to the next level. So I'm so excited to have you on.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be on the show. And yes, I'm equally passionate about that topic.
Yeah. It's sad to me because when I started 40 some years ago in the corporate world, it was a different time in the sense that I shouldn't say that. When I first started, I was in smaller companies and I had to do my own training, which in a lot of ways was a good foundation for me, because I became a lover of personal development and sought after it and never thought anything of it to go to courses, to get cassette tapes. Yes, how that's old. I know. Cassette tapes and seek, different meetings because I was needing to grow and there was no one offering anything. And then when I did join the corporate environment, I was fortunate that they had every week training classes that we could go to, and our management allowed us to spend an hour, 2 hours, half a day training and developing skills, not only tactical skills, but strategic skills, leadership skills. Then the world changed and everything was about the bottom line. And the first thing that was gone was training. Yep. And then they were complaining that there was no leaders. The succession planning was falling to the wayside and all things. And they're like, we don't know what to do. And it must be the people. Yeah, it is the people, but you're looking at the wrong people to solve the problem. So I say
Yeah.
all that to just ask you to really start with, tell us the easy questions. Tell us where you live and
Sure.
give us a little bit of background about your journey that took you to where you are today.
Sure. Well, thanks. I live outside of Boston, with my wife, my teenage kids, and what I like to call a small menagerie of pets. And and that all keeps us really busy. Um, but to answer your question about my journey and my passion around middle management in particular is so I spent the last, as you mentioned in my bio, I spent the last 20 plus years in basically in middle management roles. Sort of like you said, I was a middle manager working on the Oreo cookie and Ritz cracker brands and Nabisco, and then
Favorites.
I worked at the Hershey company, where I always joke my favorite title, my kid's favorite title I've ever had was when I was the director of Twizzlers and Jolly Ranchers, which is a cool thing to have on your business card. Um, and then, sort of moved up, into other VP of marketing roles at other companies and so forth. And from my perspective, you're really in that middle management sort of position from the day you get your first direct report all the way till, at least until you're, if you make it onto a C-suite or whatever. And even those folks, to some extent, everybody has a boss, right? So you're still sort of in the middle. But I became really passionate. So I have always, so I should say, before I was a marketer, though, in all of those companies, I was a high school teacher. Um, and that teaching background, I think, has really stuck with me. And so I've always really liked teaching, coaching, helping people grow, and so forth. And so over time, I kind of, so my last, corporate role at Cracker Barrel, I sort of became like one of the go-to non-HR people to give courses on middle management, whether it was how to build trust with your team, or how to use strategy in your day-to-day work. I gave that class actually to a bunch of restaurant managers. And I loved that topic, partly for the reason, or maybe almost entirely for the reason that you mentioned before, is that so many people end up in middle management roles, and what they don't have is any kind of training. So it sounds like you had an amazing experience getting lots of training, but most companies these days, like you said, don't want to spend the money, particularly on that middle layer, because there are just too many of them. I've talked to so many HR leaders who are like, yeah, we can usually afford like maybe one course a year, and then that's it. And the problem is that to become a great middle manager, you really need not only training, but I mean, we've all been in trainings and then forgotten everything we learned in them, like the next week, because you just get back into this, sort of mode. But not only training, but also reinforcement of what you've learned. So you have to, I mean, that's sort of a whole idea of you have to be educated, and then you have to apply what you learned, and then you have to reinforce it over and over again, or you won't really learn it. And so that's sort of my passion, was to figure out how to help middle managers who basically haven't been trained how to be middle managers. And what I find is that the biggest gap for middle managers is that they are typically promoted because they are great at doing something. They are great at being an accountant. They're great at being a marketer. They're great at being a software engineer, whatever it is. They're great at heck. I've talked with plant managers, right? They were great at running the line, whatever it is. And because they were great at that, somebody said, "Oh, well, you're really good at this. We're going to put you in charge of other people doing this." And I think the biggest gap is that nobody ever explains that once you move up and you're leading people, that leading people is now your job. And of course they need to learn how to do that, and there are lots of things that they can learn. But moving from that view of I am a doer to I am a doer now and a leader, And in most organizations, you then also have to start to influence people who aren't in your, who don't, either you don't report to them, they don't report to you. So you really become this doer, leader, influencer, but nobody told you that your role changed. My brother was telling me this story recently about his somebody that used to work for him, and he was talking to her. She has a new role, and she was saying, "Oh, I love my new job. It's just the people stuff that I'm not sure I like." Wait a second, no, that is your job. And I have this sort of analogy that I like to use is, when people sort of don't see the leadership part, the how do I, get my people to do the right things or whatever as the work. I said, nobody would ever say that an air traffic controller isn't doing anything just because they're not flying a plane. And that's sort of that gap, I think, that you have to solve for people, is how do you get them to see the job of leader as I'm actually doing something important when I am coaching my people and clearing away obstacles and making sure that the work is prioritized and that it's easy for people to get things done. So that's really what I became passionate about, helping middle managers, is how do you help people do that? It sort of started out, like I said, helping out. The HR folks would come and ask me if you do this course or do this presentation or whatever. And then when I left my corporate role, I started to write a book, which you mentioned, The Middle Matters, which was really about how do I create like a toolkit that gives people some ideas of how they can be better at those middle management roles, or at least giving them some clue as to how to be better at those middle management roles. Vicki, I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you.
There we go. I was saying that for those that are entrepreneurs, you are the middle manager, you're the top manager, you're the janitor, you're everything. So everything that we're going to discuss today is related to you as well.
Absolutely.
And I agree with what you said. I mean, that's why I do what I do. And what I found, I was a project lead for many years at my last, before retiring. And I found there was such a gap in people that were brought on my team that were, just as you say, they were promoted to this higher position, and they kept operational mindset and not the leadership mindset, the strategic mindset. And there was no one teaching them. There was no one mentoring them on how to do that. And ideally, their boss, who either promoted them or acquired them, should have been doing that. But they oftentimes were still worrying about the operational piece and they were beating them up for not reaching their goals, and not understanding that part of the reason they weren't was because they weren't building relationships. They weren't understanding how to motivate and persuade and acknowledge achievements of their people. So their people were just feeling overwhelmed, stressed, and ready to leave.
Yeah. I have you ever read, there's a great book called Multipliers by Liz Wiseman. Are you familiar with that book?
No, but I will try that one.
So she has this tremendously, so she talks about people being multipliers. This is people who are able to get more out of their people. And then you've got the opposite of that, what she calls diminishers. These are people that sort of just don't get, they're people just, kind of transactional and so forth. And she has this amazing analogy that I think applies, or I've seen that it applies as much in large corporations as it does with, often founders of small companies and so forth. And the analogy is that a diminisher is someone who is one brain with many hands. And to your point, it's like when you view your job, when you're a leader and you view your job as doing, you are just trying to do through others. And that means that there's a limit to how much that can get done, because the capacity is limited by your ability to make decisions and so forth. And so you see these situations where, whether it's a founder of a small company or somebody in the middle of a larger company, is that all the decisions have to run through one person. And eventually what happens is their calendar is full of meetings, nothing gets done without them, things are constantly getting worked and reworked, the team is getting stalled because they don't know what to do next, but they can't get the attention of the person that they need to make the decisions and so forth. And so it literally takes the capacity of the group, of the team, and crunches it down to almost nothing. And so that's sort of, I realize that's sort of like an extreme version of what happens when you are just doing, but that's the danger. If you just see your role, once you've moved past the individual contributor stage as doing, you will end up becoming a diminisher, whether you intend to or not.
Yeah, that brings to mind two things. Well, really, just like in us as influencers, you need to have your audience know, like, and trust you. And so trust often in employee relation surveys is a number one down, or you know, in that sense. It's like, oh, and the managers are like, I don't know how to make them trust me. And it always kind of blew my mind, as I often led that charge to try to change things. But of course, you know, it's a behavioral change. The manager has to know what to do that. But so in the hiring process, in a lot of companies, there are 15 layers. And one of the projects I was on was to try to eliminate this to, you know, maybe 4 layers, maybe 2 layers if you could. And that trust factor was like everyone had to have it. And so the hiring process would take 4 months or to hire someone. Well, that person now has gone to a different job, and their whole feeling of the company that they think they want to work for is being downgraded, because it's like you can't make a decision. You know, everybody has. So that was one downfall. And the second thing is, one of my mentors, who was a wonderful person, great people person, but he also had that difficulty, I think, moving from the operational. And so he used to always tell this group of 5 or 7 of us project leads, we need one brain. We need one brain. And we're like, okay, but it can't be my way or the highway. You know, this brain has to be a collaborative brain where we can bring different ways to do things. I always, later on in life, when I was teaching leadership, would say, we all, our brains, our goals and everything have to be like a GPS system, that I can input where I want to go, but the other, you know, I can be able to change and pivot as time, like recalculate and still get to that end goal, but it might not have been the way that you originally would have done it or thought, but it still gets me to that goal.
Right. And, you know, it's interesting. First, I want to pick up on your point about trust, because I've been reading a lot of books recently, or actually you mentioned cassette tapes. I'm an Audible listener, so I appreciate the book listening and listening to books all the time. But yeah, I think, you know, it's really you know, challenging sometimes to you know, to really get people to understand how important trust is. And one of the things that keeps coming up in these books is the study that Google did, I think it was like maybe 10 years ago or whatever, which is the #1 predictor. You know, Google does a lot of work in terms of how, you know, team effectiveness and so forth. The #1 predictor of whether a team was more effective or not was whether there was psychological safety in that team, which is really fundamentally about trust. Like, you know, psychological safety essentially exists when the leader trusts their people and gives them the opportunity to speak up and say things and whatever, and the people trust their leader, right? That they can say things, that they can, you know, bring up when there are mistakes, or when they see something going wrong or whatever, they don't feel like they can't say anything. And so just really interesting, you know, it's an interesting thing in the, you know, in teams and in the world of business, is this soft skill of creating an environment of trust turns out to be, in some ways, the most important thing that you can do. And so many leaders just have trouble trusting, right? Because they were
Mm-hmm.
doers, and they, to your point, they know how to do, and they tend to know how to do really well. That's why they got promoted, but therefore they don't necessarily trust their team because their team isn't going to do it as well as they did it. And
Mm-hmm.
and that ultimately becomes limiting, because if you don't trust the team to do it, even though you know they're going to do it wrong, they will not get better.
Yeah, they won't learn.
In fact, one of the things I always say about micromanagers is that when you micromanage your people, they will bring you worse work,
Yeah.
right? Because, I mean, everybody does this. If you know your
Mm-hmm.
boss is going to redo your work, how much time are you going to spend on it? So you just throw something together and let the boss redo it.
Yeah.
But again, you're back to this one brain, many hands. Like, I've now got only one person who can actually do the work. The key to getting the team to be able to do the work is to let them do it, but you have to be willing to let them do it and fail. And so then the question
Mm-hmm.
becomes, how do you create the conditions where failure is okay? So some of that is, what I find, and I'm sure you found this as well, is that teams that are sort of function like this, in this sort of, kind of choke point, one brain situation, almost always descend into chaos.
Yeah.
It's just because
Yeah.
everything becomes last minute because there just isn't enough time and whatever. And so in some ways, the key to being a great leader of a team is to actually create some process and so forth. I know people hate the word process, but if you don't have processes that allow
Yeah.
you
System.
to be ahead, to think, months in advance and so forth, then you don't have any room to allow your people to fail. And if they
Mm-hmm.
can't fail, they can't learn. And then
Mm-hmm.
if they don't learn, then all the decisions come back to you, right? And you
Mm-hmm.
become this, sort of choke point of nothing can get, as a leader, as a diminishing leader, as a choke point, I am the capacity, there's nothing that can't go beyond me. So that's where, I think, again, this idea of how do you trust your people? How do you give them room to learn and fail? I think is really, really key if you want to get the most out of a team.
Yeah, I think, we should just have another podcast and we just talk about these two, the last two subjects that we had, because we could spend another 30 minutes just on those two topics. And I think it's important that we do.
Yeah.
And also touch on the fact that when you add remote workers, it
Yeah.
even if you know how to do it and you've been successful, and I found this I was brought on during COVID as to set up a PMO for a company as a contract. And the project was innovative, and it was going to be groundbreaking change, which meant we had to be very agile. We had to fail and learn and fail and learn. And unfortunately, some of the technical leaders that were in place were not in that mindset. They
Right.
were still doing waterfall, and we should know. And so it was so difficult to get that. And when I was in person, I used a lot of times to work with technology because they always were in battle with marketing or anyone else trying to get their point across. And it was difficult to build trust
Yeah.
with these folks because they felt like failure was saying they didn't know how to do their job, and we were just saying no. Communication just is huge in this middle management piece, because you have to talk up, you have to talk down, you have to talk sideways,
Yes.
and a lot of people are just overwhelmed and they just don't do that.
So I think, to me, the answer to some of that is, and I realize this is hard and takes a really long time, so I don't mean to downplay how hard it is,
Yeah.
but I talk about this idea of, like, how do you create a learning mindset in
Yeah.
an organization so many of us who are in the corporate world got to the corporate world because we were hyperachievers. You know, we did great in high school, we did great in college, we got a great job, we got promoted, whatever. And that hyperachievement focus is really you end up with this sort of identity, right? Which is really caught up in my identity is the sum of my achievements, right? And that is one way of looking at your life is I am my degree, my promotions, my titles, etc. But another way of looking at that same set of things is that I am a great learner, that I became who I am today because I was good at learning. And so one of the things that I have been thinking about a lot recently is there some way to start to create a learning culture, an easy way to start creating a learning culture within an organization? So I've never tried this out, but I believe it would work. And there are 3 questions that I believe that you can ask yourself and your people all the time that will start to change the culture to be more open to learning. The first question is, what did you learn? And you should ask that of yourself and your people and in your one-on-ones and whatever, just constantly, what did you learn is a more important question than what did you do? The second question is, how did you grow your team? So if you're a people leader, how do you constantly, especially if you're a manager of managers, like ask your managers, how are you growing your team? How did you? And the third one is, who did you help? And so if you think about those 3 questions, the reason I came up with those 3 questions is sort of fits with this doer, leader, influencer is, as a doer, what did you learn? As a leader, how did you grow your team? And as an influencer, who did you help? And in that sense, can you create a mindset that is all about learning, growth, and collaboration, as opposed to this sort of culture that sort of exists, I think, by default, which is almost a culture of let's say almost, it's really a culture based on fear, right? People in organizations are afraid of making a mistake because I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to whatever, and all that fear does not, it stops the mindset of, how am I going to learn? How am I going to grow? How can I help people? I don't even want to help people because, I'm worried about, how I look and getting ahead. If you could get people to stop focusing on the fact that they are the sum of their achievements and get them to focus on that you got here because you were great at learning, I don't know. I just believe that would change the way people function and the way cultures work.
I have to totally agree with that. When I turned 50, I graduated from college at 50. I went, as I was traveling all over the world for my job, I was going to University of Phoenix. And so at 50, it was like, I no longer really care about crushing the ceiling. And I'm just going to use everything that I've learned over these last 4 years to just do my job the way I know it should be done. Took all the pressure off of me, and I excelled in everything that I did because I no longer cared about impressing anybody. And one of the things we talked about in a few minutes ago was about the fact that with that one brain, we were always trying to do things, think of how my boss would do things and try to do it that way, instead of saying, I'm bringing my creativity, my innovation. And management is always saying, oh, well, my people aren't creative. My people are innovative. Well, because we're crushing them, we're keeping them from doing that. And so a lot in my leadership training now, I talk about bring out that 4 and 5-year-old that was there, that's been suppressed all these years by school and management, and let them be creative, let them fail and learn from it. Let it be a Lego project where you have no idea what it's gonna look like, but all of a sudden at the end, it becomes this great thing.
And I think the key to that again is as a leader is to redefine your own role and say, my role is not to police and, basically make sure everybody's doing the right things, but to set up an environment in which people have room to fail. So if there is a product, I'm sure you've come across this a million times, if there's a project that cannot fail, then how do you create little steps along the way, milestones where people are allowed to do things, but you've built in enough time, so that they can do it wrong and they can do it again. And I think the reality is people are hesitant to do that because I don't want, nothing should be wrong. Well, it's like, well, actually what will happen is you will find that people become more and more proficient and capable and able to move projects along faster and all that kind of thing, if you allow them to learn and allow them to grow. And it's this sort of weird thing. I have a funny analogy that I always use for this, which is green eggs and ham. When you go to your boss and you say, would you like this on a plane? And they say no. And so you would say, well, would you like it on a train? They say no. And you can keep going on and on with this approach forever, and you will never bring them the right thing because they are never telling you why what you're bringing them is not meeting the criteria or meeting the your expectations. But if you focus more on, okay, that was a great attempt, here's what I thought was great about it, here's where it's working, and here's where it's not working, and then let them come back and say, okay, here's my next attempt, and it will get better, because this is how we actually, I think as human beings, we tend to learn much more from positive reinforcement than we do from negative correction, number one. And number two, I think it's really important, and I believe this really strongly, is when you're leading, is you have to be as specific about your positive reinforcement as you are about your negative criticism. And that's another place where I see leaders sort of fall down, is they tend to say, you're doing great, and then very specifically say, but you did this wrong. But it's really important to tell people what they did right so that you get more of it.
One of the things as a project lead, we always had an issues call, which all the stakeholders, everybody was involved to hear, so there'd be more than one brain trying to solve this problem. But I always thought it should be, opportunity call as opposed to issues calls, because it would have been more positive, and the person who was faced with that opportunity might then not look at it as I'm screwing up, I'm doing terrible, and everybody's going to think less of me, as opposed to, please, I have this great challenge that I would love for your input to help me, because your vast experience. And I think it just would be so much more of a positive thing than an issues call.
No, I love that. And I think it's right. I mean, it's like, how do you get people to do more of something that is good? In fact, I think in some ways you're almost better off finding the kernel of good stuff and saying, do more of this, rather than constantly kind of telling people what's right. Actually, and I'm sure, I think this is just true for everyone, is people generally don't like to give feedback because they think of feedback as something negative or critical or punitive. And feedback is the only way that we can all get better. But if you can sort of train yourself as a leader to give positive feedback when there is an opportunity of positive feedback, because you're reinforcing positive behaviors, then on the occasions where you do have to give some critical or feedback or constructive feedback, you are more able to do it because the people on your team know that tomorrow they'll probably get praised for something. Instead, what we do is we just wait, until end of year review or whatever, and then we give all the negative feedback, and people are, I don't know what to do with this.
So time is flying by, but that's another topic we'll add to the next time we meet, because we can spend some time, as I train also in public speaking, and I give feedback all the time to people, because just like anything, you do something and generally you don't get any feedback. You just are told, well, that didn't work, but the why
Exactly.
isn't given sometimes, or the suggestion of what might work differently, is not given. And so another topic, but the one thing I wanted to talk about just briefly before we end is corporate PTSD, which I thought that was a great thing. And I'd love for you to just tell us, what did you mean by that?
So, it's funny. When I left my corporate role, I was, it's funny, all through my career, I've not been a great networker. In the last year, I've just become just a fearless networker. And had called up this guy I hadn't talked to in probably 20 years or something. And we were chatting, and he said, "Oh, you're leaving your corporate job." He's like, "You're going to feel corporate PTSD for probably at least the next 2 years." And I was like, okay. And it's interesting. What I mean by that is, when you talk to people who have left their corporate roles, they often are like, I really never want to go back. Because there is this sort of soul crushing sense of, every day you go to work and you could say something wrong, you could do something wrong, you could make a mistake, you could just be on the wrong side of, somebody, or somebody is decided they don't like you, or they're promoting somebody else, or whatever
Yes.
it is, and you are sitting there beating yourself up over, what am I doing wrong? Nobody's giving you that
Yeah.
feedback. And so you find yourself feeling this anxiety day
Mm-hmm.
in, day out, in your corporate role, because you are constantly under this sort of sense of fear of what's going to happen, and what
Yeah.
am I going to do wrong, or will I lose my job, and so forth. And what this person was talking about, and I definitely have felt it myself, is that once you leave, that there are a lot of things that are still going on in your brain that are holding you back, even when you aren't working for the corporation anymore, that are still there, like
Yeah.
this sort of sense of anger, or this sense of I'm not good enough, or whatever it is that you keep feeling for months and months, even years after you after you left your job. And so that's what I mean by corporate PTSD. There's a lot of people out there who have left, retired, whatever it is, who are like, gosh, what left with this sort of profound feeling of sort of negativity about themselves, about their work environment, and so forth. And so for me, being an optimistic person, so for this, how do we change that? How do
Yeah.
you make that better? And part of it is, for me, is not, I mean, it's hard to change the people at the top,
Yeah. It is.
because they believe they got to the top because they were great.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're going to keep doing the things that they're doing. But where you do find people who are like still open to learning and something different is that sort of middle layer who is just still trying to figure it out. And so for me, it was, how do where could I focus my energy to help people feel better about their experience in the corporate environment?
Mm-hmm.
That's how I came up with, again, I like working with middle leaders and trying to help them sort of focus on, how do you become great in the middle,
Yeah.
as opposed to, how do I get to the top? And
Yes.
your story was terrific, right? Is when you stop trying to get to the top, you often become better,
Mm-hmm.
because you are focused on doing great work where you are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are, I'm sure, managers that I had when I first started that didn't promote me because they didn't think that I had what it took, but
Right.
then always had me help them with it was
Right.
interesting. It was interesting. All right. Well, it is time now for us to share my slide that has the contact information. If you have enjoyed this conversation and want to connect with Jeff to learn more of how he might help you or your company, please go ahead and you can share the screen. If you are just listening, I tell you every time, you should have had a paper and pencil and taken notes. All this will be in my show notes that you can grab this, but quick, go grab a paper and pencil now so you can get this. Go to my YouTube channel, Vicki Noethling. Please subscribe, as well as my findyourleadershipconfidence.com website. The website is Jeff Sigel, SIGEL.com. He also has a website, that proprioceptive.io. On LinkedIn, you can find him by his name, Jeff Sigel, again, Sigel. And YouTube is at Twinning Strategy. Twinning is TWINNING strategy. He is a twin, and that's why it's called at Twinning Strategy.
Yep.
I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to quickly tell you what you can find on his website that might help you, or what is out there on YouTube, again, that might help you.
Awesome. Thank you, Vicki. So I would say the most helpful thing that you might be able to find on jeffsigel.com right now is information and a preview of my brand new book, The Middle Matters, a toolkit for middle managers, which is it's really stories from my own career, often of me sort of falling down, dusting myself off and getting back up and so forth. And so I think that's, probably the most helpful. And then the other thing is, if you follow me on LinkedIn, I have a weekly newsletter where I'm always talking about middle management topics. And so I'd love to have you follow me.
Awesome. Well, Jeff, great conversation. Definitely have to have you back so we can continue the conversation on at least those 3 topics. As always, I just thank you for being a wonderful guest.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And I remind everyone that life is a journey, and it's up to you to enjoy the ride. This is Vicki Noethling, signing off.
Thank you for tuning into the Find Your Leadership Confidence podcast with Vicki Noethling, where we share impactful lessons that help you grow as an individual, grow your confidence, and find the positive and good within you so you powerfully and authentically become the best version of yourself. Remember to visit our website at www.findyourleadershipconfidence.com and enjoy even more great episodes like this one. Again, while you're here, subscribe to us via your favorite network. We look forward to seeing you next time on the Find Your Leadership Confidence podcast.